The snowstorm hit faster than we expected. What started as light flurries quickly turned into a raging blizzard, and soon, the winding mountain road was impossible to navigate. I was with my two friends, Sarah and Armin, and we had no choice but to find shelter. That's when we spotted it, a cabin in the distance, barely visible through the whiteout. Relieved, we trudged through the knee-deep snow, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. The cabin looked old, its wooden frame warped and weathered by time. A single dim light flickered in the window, casting long, eerie shadows on the snow. "This has to be someone's place," Sarah said, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. "We'll explain," Armin replied, shivering. "Better than freezing out here." The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and bitterly cold, as though the cabin hadn't been lived in for years. Dust covered the furniture, a single chair, a rickety table, and an old fireplace with a few logs stacked nearby. The only sign of life was the dim oil lamp flickering on the table. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the small space. No answer. "Looks abandoned," Armin said, dropping his bag by the door. "Let's light the fire." We set to work, the crackling flames bringing some warmth to the otherwise lifeless room. Sarah sat close to the fire, rubbing her hands together. "This place feels strange," she whispered, her eyes darting around. She wasn't wrong. The cabin had an oppressive atmosphere, as if the walls were watching us, but we brushed it off as nerves. We were tired and cold, and the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. As night fell, the wind grew louder, battering the cabin with icy fury. We huddled close to the fire, the shadows dancing on the walls. That's when we heard it, a faint, high-pitched scream. Sarah froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," I said, though my heart was racing. But then it came again. Louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It sounded human, agonized, desperate. The three of us exchanged uneasy glances. Armin grabbed the flashlight and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. "There's nothing out there," he said, his voice shaky. The scream came again, piercing and guttural, echoing through the cabin. It felt like it was coming from inside. I stood up, my legs trembling as I scanned the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift unnaturally, moving even when the firelight didn't. Sarah clutched my arm. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And go where?" Armin snapped. "We'd freeze out there." Suddenly, the oil lamp on the table went out, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light came from the dying fire, its embers glowing faintly. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, like something feral and angry. It came from the corner of the room where the shadows were darkest. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to move. Slowly, the shadows began to take shape, forming a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the door. Armin was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. "Armin!" I screamed, but he didn't move. The figure lunged toward him, its movements jerky and unnatural. The cabin filled with a deafening screech, like nails on a chalkboard, as the thing reached for him. I yanked the door open, dragging Sarah outside. The cold hit us like a wall, but we didn't stop. We ran blindly into the blizzard, the screams of the creature echoing behind us. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, the cabin was gone. We turned back, but the place where it had stood was nothing but untouched snow. We stumbled back to the main road hours later, freezing and exhausted. A passing car picked us up, and we told the driver everything. He listened in silence, his face pale. "That cabin," he said finally, his voice low. "It burned down years ago. No one's been up there since. Even now, I can still hear the screams in my nightmares. A haunting reminder of that night. The storm saved us, but it also led us to something we were never meant to find." The storm hit harder than the forecast had warned. Thick snow blanketed the mountain road. Visibility dropped to near zero, and my car skidded dangerously on the icy curves. I was with my two closest friends, Sarah and Armin, heading home after a weekend of skiing. We were miles from the nearest town, and the howling wind made it impossible to drive any further. That's when we saw it, a large, shadowy structure looming through the blizzard, an old ski lodge. Its windows were dark, and the wooden exterior looked weathered and forgotten. We had no other choice. I parked as close as I could, and we trudged through the snow, the icy wind cutting through our jackets. The front door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. The inside was just as eerie as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. The lobby was large, with a grand staircase leading to the upper floors. Faded posters of skiing competitions from decades ago hung on the walls, and the reception desk was cluttered with yellowed papers and an old register. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah whispered, hugging herself for warmth. "We don't have a choice," Armin replied, brushing snow off his coat. "Let's just wait out the storm and leave in the morning." We found an old fireplace in the lounge and managed to get a fire going. The flickering flames cast long, jagged shadows across the room, making the already eerie atmosphere worse. As the warmth seeped in, we started to relax, until we heard the first sound, a faint creak, like a floorboard groaning under someone's weight. We all froze, staring at each other. "Probably just the wind," I said, though my voice wavered. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft thud. It was coming from the floor above us. "Maybe it's an animal," Sarah suggested, though her face was pale. "Only one way to find out," Armin said, grabbing a flashlight. Reluctantly, we followed him up the grand staircase, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, each leading to what were once guest rooms. The air was colder here, and the smell of decay was stronger. We stopped in front of one door, slightly ajar. The sound had come from inside. Armand pushed it open with the flashlight trembling in his hand. The room was empty, but something felt off. The bed was still made, the sheets yellowed with age, and the curtains hung limply over the frosted window. A broken chair lay in the corner, its splintered legs looking oddly sharp, but the thing that chilled me most was the mirror on the wall. It was cracked, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in its reflection. "We should go back downstairs," Sarah said quickly, her voice tight with fear. Armin nodded and we turned to leave, only to hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming toward us from the end of the hallway. My heart pounded as I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. "Let's go," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm. We rushed back downstairs and bolted the lounge door behind us. The fire was still burning, but the warmth felt distant, as if the room itself had grown colder. We huddled close, too scared to speak. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct, and they were coming from all around us. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, each one speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Sarah covered her ears, her face twisted in terror. "Make it stop," she cried. The fire flickered violently and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the thick shadows that seemed to be closing in. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and slimy. "Run!" Armin shouted, and we scrambled toward the front door. It wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pulled, the heavy wooden door refused to open. The growls grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move, taking on shapes, tall, twisted figures with glowing eyes. One of them reached out, its skeletal hand inches from Sarah's face. In a burst of adrenaline, Armin grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window by the door. The glass shattered, letting in a blast of icy wind. Without thinking, we climbed through, cutting our hands on the jagged edges. We ran through the snow, the growls and whispers following us, until the lodge disappeared into the blizzard. We didn't stop running until we reached my car. By some miracle, it started, and we sped down the icy road, not daring to look back. Even now, I can still hear those whispers in my dreams, and the shadows. They sometimes flicker at the edge of my vision. That ski lodge was no shelter. It was a trap, a place meant to keep you forever. It was the dead of winter, and the lake had frozen over completely. The air was sharp and cold, and the snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly around us. My friends, Armin and Sarah, had convinced me to join them for a weekend getaway at a remote cabin near the lake. It sounded peaceful, even magical, until the sun began to set that evening. The first thing that felt off was the silence. No wind, no rustling trees, no distant sounds of animals, just a heavy, oppressive stillness. We decided to take a walk on the frozen lake before it got completely dark, thinking the vast expanse would make for some stunning photos. As we stepped onto the ice, the setting sun cast an eerie glow over the frozen surface, reflecting pale orange hues that felt unnaturally dim. Sarah laughed nervously, her breath visible in the freezing air. "This is kinda creepy, isn't it?" "It's just a lake," Armin said, though he didn't sound as confident as usual. "Relax. Let's just enjoy the view." We walked further out, the snow crunching under our boots. The ice beneath seemed solid, but every so often I'd hear a faint crack, like the lake was groaning under the weight of something unseen. I kept telling myself it was normal, just the ice shifting, but my nerves were already on edge. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow from the trees lining the shore, but it wasn't. A dark, elongated figure moved across the ice far ahead of us. It didn't walk. It glided, almost as if it wasn't touching the ground at all. Its shape was indistinct, constantly shifting, as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Sarah followed my gaze and froze. "What is that?" Armin squinted, his expression darkening. "Probably just someone else on the lake," he said, though his voice trembled. But we all knew that wasn't true. The shadow stopped moving, and for a moment, everything was still again. Then, without warning, it began to grow. It stretched impossibly tall, its form becoming more distorted, as if it were pulling itself out of the ice. A chill ran through me, colder than the winter air. "Let's go back," Sarah said quickly, tugging at my arm. We turned to head back to the cabin, but the shadow moved again, closer this time. It was faster than anything human, darting across the ice in unnatural jerks and pauses. I could feel it watching us, even though it had no eyes. My chest tightened with fear, and my legs felt heavy, as if the ice itself was trying to trap me. "Hurry up!" Armin yelled, his voice breaking the silence. We started running, our boots slipping and sliding on the ice. The shadow followed, keeping pace with us effortlessly. It didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, like a storm bearing down on us. My lungs burned as I pushed myself to keep going, the cabin's faint outline barely visible through the encroaching darkness. Just as we reached the shore, Sarah screamed. I turned and saw her on the ground, her ankle twisted at an odd angle. The shadow loomed behind her, its shape no longer shifting. It was solid now, towering and humanoid but grotesque, with long, spindly limbs and a face that was nothing but a void. "Help her!" Armin shouted, grabbing a branch from the ground and swinging it wildly. The shadow didn't flinch. It passed through the branch as though it wasn't really there. I ran back and pulled Sarah to her feet, adrenaline overpowering my fear. Together we stumbled toward the cabin, the shadow closing in. The air grew colder with every step, and my vision blurred as frost formed on my eyelashes. By the time we slammed the door shut behind us, the cabin was pitch black. The shadow was outside, circling, its form pressing against the frosted windows. "We can't stay here," Sarah whimpered, clutching her injured leg. "There's nowhere else to go," Armin said, pacing the room. "We're trapped." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature inside plummeted. The shadow was no longer outside. It was inside, filling the room with its impossible darkness. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if it were alive. Sarah screamed again as the shadow reached for her, its long fingers stretching toward her face. I grabbed the lantern and swung it desperately. The light seemed to hurt it. The shadow recoiled, its form unraveling like smoke. Without thinking, I lit the lantern and held it high, forcing the shadow back toward the door. It screeched, a sound so piercing it felt like needles in my ears. The moment the shadow vanished, the lights came back on and the cabin was warm again. We didn't speak. We just sat there, too shaken to move, until dawn broke and the storm cleared. When we finally left the cabin, the lake was empty, the ice pristine, but none of us will ever forget the shadow. Its shape, its presence, its intent. Even now, I can't look at a frozen lake without feeling its cold, watchful gaze. It was a bitterly cold night, the kind where the wind howls like a living thing and frost etches intricate patterns on every window pane. I was alone in the cabin, tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The fireplace crackled weakly, barely keeping the chill at bay. My breath misted in the dim light, and the clock on the mantel ticked steadily toward midnight. I had just started to drift off in the old armchair when I heard it, a knock at the door. It was faint, hesitant, yet somehow insistent. My heart jumped. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere on a night like this? Another knock, louder this time, echoed through the cabin. I got up, my pulse quickening, and approached the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice wavering slightly. No response, just the relentless wind outside. Cautiously, I unlatched the door and pulled it open a crack. A man stood on the porch, shivering violently. His face was pale and gaunt, his lips cracked and blue. His clothes were thin and torn, utterly unsuited for the freezing weather. Frost clung to his hair and eyebrows, and his hands were bare, raw, and red. "Please, let me in," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. His eyes, hollow and desperate, met mine, and for a moment I hesitated. Something about him felt wrong, but he looked on the brink of collapse, and my conscience wouldn't let me turn him away. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. He stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor near the fire. I shut the door quickly, locking out the freezing wind, and turned to help him. He sat hunched over, his shoulders rising and falling as he struggled to catch his breath. "Are you lost?" I asked, grabbing a blanket from the couch and draping it over him. He didn't answer right away, just stared at the fire with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, he muttered, "The storm. I was caught in the storm." I nodded, though there hadn't been any storms that night. "Where are you coming from?" Again, no answer. Instead, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Do you live here alone?" The question sent a shiver down my spine, and not from the cold. "Yes," I lied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "But someone's coming to join me in the morning." His lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "That's good. You shouldn't be alone." An uncomfortable silence settled between us. I watched him warily as he sat there, his hands stretched toward the fire. There was something unnatural about him, something I couldn't put into words. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, despite the roaring flames. "Let me get you something warm to drink," I said, more to break the silence than out of hospitality. I walked to the small kitchen and started boiling water for tea, my hands trembling. I could feel his gaze on me, even though I wasn't looking at him. When I turned back, he was gone. The blanket lay crumpled on the floor, and the cabin door was slightly ajar, letting in a blast of icy air. I rushed to the door, peering out into the darkness. Snow swirled in the wind, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. My heart raced as I shut the door and bolted it. The cabin felt different now, darker, quieter, as though the walls were closing in. I told myself I was imagining things, that the man had simply left, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then I saw it. In the frost on the window pane, a handprint, long fingers, unnaturally thin, pressed against the glass. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, frozen in place. Slowly, the handprint began to fade, as if it were being absorbed into the frost. A sudden noise behind me made me spin around. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in complete darkness. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the clock, louder now, almost deafening. And then, the knock came again. This time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. I turned slowly, my breath hitching as I saw the man standing outside, his face pressed against the glass. But he wasn't shivering anymore. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and his lips were curled into that same eerie smile. Frost spread across the window pane, creeping inward like icy fingers reaching for me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Grabbing my coat, I bolted out the back door into the freezing night, not stopping until I reached the main road. The next morning, when I returned with the local authorities, the cabin was empty. No sign of the man, no frost on the window. But I'll never forget the way his hollow eyes followed me, or the faint, desperate whisper I heard as I ran, "Don't leave me alone." The blizzard started without warning. By the time I realized how bad it was, the roads were impassable, and my small mountain cabin was buried under thick, relentless snow. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. I'd come here to escape the noise of the city, but now I was trapped, alone, or so I thought. The first strange thing happened late that night. I was curled up by the fire, trying to distract myself with an old book, when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the back door. My heart skipped a beat. It sounded too deliberate to be the wind. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door cautiously. The scratching stopped the moment I got close. When I opened the door, the freezing wind hit me like a wall, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the snow, no signs of life, just the storm raging outside. I shut the door quickly, locking it. My breath fogged in the icy air, and I told myself it was just the weather playing tricks on me. But deep down, unease started to creep in. Hours passed, and the cabin grew colder despite the roaring fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows cast by the flickering flames seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Every creak of the wooden floor, every whistle of the wind made my skin crawl. Then came the footsteps. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder, closer, heavy, deliberate, and definitely not my own. They seemed to circle the cabin, moving from one side to the other. I clutched the flashlight tighter, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever it was had been waiting for me to speak. I stood frozen in place, straining to hear over the storm. Then from behind me came a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. Slowly I turned toward the sound, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The living room was empty, but the shadows on the walls, they didn't match the furniture. One of them was taller, broader, and it moved. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the cabin. The shadow detached from the wall, rising to its full height, and began to take shape. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that stretched too far, and a face that was nothing more than a gaping void. I ran for the bedroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands shook as I pushed a dresser against the door, creating a makeshift barricade. But the growls didn't stop. They were outside the door now, accompanied by the sound of something sharp dragging across the wood. Then the whispering started. It wasn't in a language I could understand, but it seeped into my mind like poison, making it hard to think. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside my head. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the snow outside, faintly illuminating the frost-covered window. That's when I saw it. Two glowing eyes, staring at me from the other side of the glass. I stumbled back, tripping over the bed and falling to the floor. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared, unblinking, as if savoring my fear. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo through the very walls. Then, the door burst open. The shadowy figure loomed in the doorway, its form filling the room. The air grew colder, and my body felt like it was being weighed down, as if the very atmosphere was pressing against me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It reached for me, its long, spindly fingers inches from my face. In a last desperate act, I grabbed the oil lamp from the nightstand and hurled it at the figure. The glass shattered, and flames erupted, filling the room with light. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech, its form writhing and dissolving in the firelight. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing my coat and boots, I fled into the storm. The snow blinded me, the cold bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I just ran, not stopping until I reached the main road where a passing plow truck found me. The cabin burned to the ground that night. The authorities said it was an accident, probably a faulty fireplace. But I know the truth. Something evil was in that cabin with me, something that wasn't human. And though I escaped, I can still hear its whispers in my dreams calling me back. The Arctic expedition was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. I joined a small team of researchers to document the untouched beauty of the ice fields and gather data on the melting glaciers. We were stationed in a remote outpost, miles away from any civilization. The landscape was breathtaking, vast stretches of white that gleamed under the pale sun and seemed to stretch endlessly. But as the days grew colder and the nights darker, the beauty turned eerie. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the groaning of the ice as it shifted beneath us. The isolation was getting to all of us, but no one wanted to admit it. Then the howling started. It was the second night of a fierce storm. The wind was brutal, rattling the outpost windows and howling through the cracks like a living thing. I was sitting in the common room with Dr. Fields and Ellie, the youngest member of our team. We were trying to pass the time with idle chatter when it happened. At first, we thought it was the wind, long, mournful howls carried on the icy gusts. But then it changed. The sound became deeper, more guttural, echoing across the frozen wasteland. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part animal, part something else entirely. "Did you hear that?" Ellie whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Dr. Fields nodded slowly. "Wolves, maybe," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. There were no wolves this far north. The howls came again, louder this time, and closer. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The three of us exchanged uneasy glances, and Ellie moved closer to the fire. We decided to ignore it, chalking it up to the storm. But deep down, none of us believed that. The next day, we went about our work as usual, trying to pretend the night before hadn't unsettled us. The storm had calmed and the sky was clear, but the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. That afternoon, one of our colleagues, Sam, came back from a solo survey of the ice field. He looked pale, his hands trembling as he set down his gear. "There's something out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Sam hesitated, glancing toward the window. "I saw tracks, big ones, and they weren't human." The room fell silent. Dr. Fields frowned, trying to keep us calm. "Could be a bear. They've been known to wander this far." Sam shook his head. "It's not a bear. Whatever made those tracks, it's bigger." That night, the howls returned. They started faintly, just like before, but soon grew louder, more insistent. They didn't sound like wolves anymore. There was an unnatural quality to them, a rage that sent shivers through me. The outpost felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. The fire in the hearth seemed dimmer, and even the lights flickered as the howls echoed through the night. Ellie was trembling, clutching her blanket tightly. "I think it's circling us," she whispered. The thought made my skin crawl. I peeked out the window, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. The howls continued, their source impossible to pinpoint, as if they were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then came the thud. It was loud, reverberating through the outpost, as if something massive had slammed against the walls. We jumped, our breaths caught in our throats. Dr. Fields grabbed the rifle we kept for emergencies and motioned for us to stay put. Slowly, he approached the door. My heart pounded as he opened it a crack, peering outside. The wind rushed in, icy and sharp, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no movement, just the endless white expanse. He shut the door quickly, bolting it. "Nothing," he muttered, but his face was pale. The thuds continued, each one shaking the building, followed by those dreadful howls. They grew louder, angrier, until I thought my ears would burst. The air inside the outpost felt suffocating, like something was pressing down on us. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, unnatural, and filled with dread. We didn't sleep that night. None of us spoke. We just sat there, waiting for something to happen. When morning came, the howls didn't return. But outside the outpost, we found something that froze my blood. Massive claw marks gouged into the ice, circling the building. They were deep and precise, too deliberate to be caused by the storm. We left that day, abandoning our research and calling for an emergency evacuation. None of us could explain what happened, but I know one thing. I will never forget those howls. They still haunt me, echoing in my mind, a reminder of the terror that lurks in the frozen wilderness. It was the first snowfall of the year, and everything was blanketed in a pristine layer of white. I was staying at a remote cabin for a much-needed escape from the city, surrounded by endless woods and silence. The tranquility of the scene was almost dreamlike, but it didn't last long. It began early one morning. I woke up to find a strange pattern in the snow outside my cabin window. Footprints. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone had wandered too close during the night, but as I looked closer, something felt off. The footprints were small, like a child's, and perfectly spaced. They started from the middle of the snow-covered field, not from the woods or the cabin. There was no trail leading to where they began, just an isolated set of prints appearing out of nowhere. They continued toward the edge of the forest and disappeared completely, as if the person had vanished into thin air. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my coat and boots, stepping out into the cold to investigate. The air was crisp, and the snow crunched underfoot as I approached the tracks. They were clearer up close. Bare feet, each print pressed deep into the snow despite the freezing temperature. "Hello?" I called out, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. My voice echoed, but there was no response, only the quiet whisper of the wind through the trees. I followed the footprints toward the forest. The stillness around me grew heavier, almost suffocating, as though the woods were holding their breath. The tracks continued in a straight line, unwavering, but there was still no sign of where they had come from. Then the woods fell silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The birds stopped chirping. The wind stopped rustling the branches. Everything was eerily still. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. The quiet was unnatural, oppressive, and it made my skin crawl. The footprints stopped abruptly a few feet ahead. They didn't lead to a tree or a clearing, they just ended. The snow beyond them was undisturbed, a perfect, untouched white. I stared, my mind racing to make sense of it. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice shaky. The only answer was the hollow echo of my own words. I turned to head back to the cabin, but something stopped me in my tracks. The footprints had changed. Where once there were only small, bare feet, there were now larger ones beside them, heavier, deeper. The prints looked like boots, yet they hadn't been there before. It was as if someone else had joined the invisible figure, walking alongside them. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, glancing nervously at the trees. I felt watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing on me from all directions. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, moving even though there was no wind. I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, every creak of the old wood making me jump. I peeked out the window, hoping the footprints would still be there, some proof that I wasn't losing my mind, but they were gone. The snow outside was untouched, as if no one had ever walked there. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was seeing things, but it was true. No tracks, no marks, just an endless blanket of white. That night, the cabin felt smaller, colder. The fire in the hearth struggled to stay lit, the flames flickering weakly. As I lay in bed, the wind picked up outside, howling like a mournful cry. I told myself it was just a storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then I heard it, a faint knock at the door. My blood turned to ice. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept toward the door, my hands trembling. "Who's there?" I whispered, but no one answered. Against every instinct, I opened the door a crack. The cold rushed in, and my heart nearly stopped. On the porch in the freshly fallen snow were footprints, the small, bare ones. They led right up to my door, and then stopped. There was no one there. I slammed the door shut, bolting it and backing away. The wind howled louder, and the cabin creaked as if something was pressing against it. I didn't sleep that night. When morning finally came, the snow outside was undisturbed again, but the feeling of unease never left me. Even now, I can't explain what happened. But every time it snows, I find myself looking out the window, dreading the sight of those footprints leading to nowhere. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a secluded chalet perched at the peak of a snow-covered mountain, far from the noise of the world. My friends, Sarah and Armin, had found it online, advertised as a tranquil escape with breathtaking views. The pictures looked stunning, and the price was too good to pass up. But as we approached the chalet that evening, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. The drive up the mountain had been treacherous, with winding roads barely visible under the fresh snowfall. By the time we reached the chalet, night had fallen, and the world was bathed in an eerie silver light. The chalet itself looked different from the photos, older, darker, as if it had been abandoned for years. The wooden beams were weathered, and the windows, fogged and cracked, reflected the cold moonlight. "Looks cozy enough," Armin joked, though his voice lacked confidence. Sarah didn't say anything, just tightened her scarf and hurried inside. The interior wasn't much better. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. The furniture was covered in dust, and the fireplace, though grand, seemed reluctant to light. We managed to get it going, and the warmth eased some of the tension, but the feeling of being watched lingered. "It's just an old place," I told myself. "Nothing to worry about." After dinner, we settled in the living room, the fire crackling weakly. Sarah was flipping through an old book she'd found on the shelf, while Armin was fiddling with his phone, trying to get a signal. I stared out the window, mesmerized by the snow falling gently outside. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible against the white backdrop, standing at the edge of the tree line. It was too far to make out any details, but it was tall, motionless, and distinctly human. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was still there. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, pointing out the window. Sarah and Armin joined me, squinting into the darkness. "What?" Sarah asked. "I don't see anything." The figure was gone. "It was just there," I insisted, my heart racing. "Probably a shadow," Armin said dismissively, "or your imagination." But I knew what I'd seen. As the night wore on, the unease only grew. Strange sounds echoed through the chalet, the creak of floorboards upstairs, the faint rustle of something brushing against the walls. At first, we tried to laugh it off. "Old houses make noise," Armin said, though his voice wavered. Around midnight, the fire sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah grabbed a flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. "I'll get some wood," she said, heading for the pile near the door. She hadn't taken 2 steps when we heard it. A loud, deliberate knock on the front door. The 3 of us froze, exchanging nervous glances. Who could possibly be out here at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? "Maybe someone's lost," Armin said, though he didn't sound convinced. He approached the door cautiously, pulling it open a crack. The wind howled, blowing snow into the room, but there was no one there, just the empty porch and the swirling snow beyond. Armand shut the door quickly, bolting it. Probably the wind, he muttered, but we all knew better. The sounds inside the chalet grew louder after that. Footsteps echoed above us, heavy and deliberate, even though we hadn't gone upstairs. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, shifting and twisting as if they were alive. Then came the whispering. It started faintly, just at the edge of hearing, but it grew louder, filling the room with a low, guttural murmur. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. Sarah clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave," she whispered. Armin grabbed the keys and we rushed to the door, only to find it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pulled, the heavy wooden door refused to open. The whispers turned to laughter, cold, mocking, and echoing through the walls. Desperate, we fled upstairs, hoping to find another way out. But the second floor was worse. The air was colder, and the shadows were darker, moving unnaturally across the walls. At the end of the hall stood a door, slightly ajar. From inside came the sound of faint breathing. "I'm not going in there," Sarah whispered, trembling. "We have to," Armin said, his voice barely audible. He pushed the door open, and what we saw froze us in place. The room was empty, but the walls were covered in scratches, deep, jagged marks, as if something with claws had been trapped inside. The window was shattered, snow blowing in, and on the floor were footprints leading out into the night. We didn't sleep that night. When morning came, the whispers stopped and the door opened as if nothing had happened. We left the chalet without looking back, driving down the mountain in silence, and I pray I never find out what it was. The snowstorm hit without warning. One moment I was driving up the mountain road, and the next, the world was consumed by a blinding wall of white. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the car as I inched forward, desperate to find shelter. My headlights barely cut through the snow, and I knew I couldn't go much further. Then, through the blizzard, I saw it, a faint light glowing in the distance. I turned down a narrow path and eventually came upon a small cabin, half buried in snow. Relief washed over me as I pulled up and killed the engine. The cabin looked old, but sturdy, with smoke curling from the chimney. I grabbed my bag and hurried inside, the icy wind biting at my skin. The warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the storm. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the room smelled faintly of wood smoke and something earthy. The cabin seemed empty, but I assumed whoever lived here would be back soon. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed in the silence. There was no answer. I decided to wait. Sitting by the fire, I tried to shake off the unease that crept over me. The storm outside intensified, the wind slamming against the walls like a desperate plea to get in. The windows rattled, and shadows danced on the wooden walls, making the room feel smaller. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something moving past the frosted window. I froze, staring at the glass, but the storm made it impossible to see anything clearly. Then, there it was again, lingering this time. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the reach of the light from the cabin. My heart pounded as I got up and moved closer to the window. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, watching. Its outline was faint, blurred by the swirling snow, but its presence was undeniable. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, opened the door a crack, and shone the beam into the storm. The cold was unbearable, cutting through me like a knife, but the figure was gone. No sign of it, not even footprints in the snow. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I backed away, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the unease didn't go away. The wind howled louder, and the shadows inside the cabin seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though the windows showed nothing but a wall of white. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder, more insistent. My stomach churned as I approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to stay away. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, this time harder, almost frantic. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, clutching it tightly as I inched closer to the door. Slowly, I unbolted it and opened it just enough to peek outside. The storm was blinding, snow swirling violently in every direction. But there, just a few feet away, was the figure. It was closer now, and the faint outline I'd seen earlier had solidified. It was tall, too tall, with elongated limbs and a face obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even as I stared at it. The poker slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis, and I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. I backed away, the air in the cabin growing colder despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound like a growl, coming from outside the window. Slowly, I turned to look. The figure was there, its face pressed against the glass, or rather, where its face should have been. The void where its eyes should have been stared directly at me, and I felt a chill unlike anything I'd ever known. It raised a hand, long fingers scratching against the glass, the sound sharp and grating. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the scratching grew louder, more frenzied. The window didn't break, but the frost on the glass began to spread, darkening as though the figure was draining the warmth from the room. I don't remember grabbing my bag or running out into the storm. I only remember the fear, the way my body moved on instinct, desperate to get away. The storm swallowed me whole, the wind roaring in my ears, but I didn't stop running until I saw the faint glow of lights in the distance, a ranger station. When I told the rangers what happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them finally said, "You're lucky. Most people who see it don't make it back." I never returned to that mountain, but even now, when I'm alone on cold, snowy nights, I feel its presence, watching, waiting. And I know that some storms bring more than just snow. The first few days of the polar night were enchanting. The endless darkness painted the small Arctic town in hues of deep blue and silver, and the snow reflected the faint light of the moon and stars. I had come here for research, eager to study the effects of constant night on the human mind. But as the days turned to weeks, the darkness began to feel suffocating. The people of the town seemed accustomed to it, moving through their routines as if nothing was unusual. But there was something in their eyes, a quiet unease, a secret they weren't sharing. One evening, as I walked back to my small cabin, I noticed the streets were emptier than usual. The town felt abandoned, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the snow. I looked up at the sky, half expecting the moon to vanish too. It was then that I saw the first strange thing. At the edge of the woods that surrounded the town, a faint light flickered. It wasn't the cold blue of the moon or the orange of a street lamp. This was different, pale, almost greenish, and it pulsed like a heartbeat. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Don't go near it." The voice startled me. An old man bundled in layers of clothing stood a few feet away. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. "Stay inside tonight," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lock your doors. Close your curtains." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, shaken, before hurrying back to my cabin. That night, the air felt heavier, colder. I locked the door and drew the curtains, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The flickering light I'd seen earlier was still in my mind, pulsing like an afterimage burned into my vision. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. At first I thought it was the wind or a stray branch, but the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. My heart pounded as I approached the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the snow, barely visible in the faint light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, a blank slate that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. It tilted its head, as if it could sense me watching. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. The tapping stopped, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, or at least I felt like it was staring through the glass. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. The temperature in the cabin dropped sharply, and my breath misted in the air. The fire in the hearth sputtered, the flames shrinking until they were barely embers. The only sound was the creaking of the walls, as if the cabin itself was straining under some unseen pressure. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a breeze carrying distant voices, but they grew louder, filling the room with a language I didn't understand. The shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to move, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. I tried to block it out, covering my ears and shutting my eyes, but the whispers were inside my head, burrowing deep. The figure outside began to move, gliding closer to the window without leaving a single footprint in the snow. Desperate, I grabbed the lantern on the table and lit it. The sudden burst of light made the whispers falter, and the figure stopped, retreating slightly. The air in the room grew lighter, and the fire roared back to life as if given new strength. But the figure didn't leave. It lingered just beyond the edge of the light, its blank face turned toward me. The whispers faded, but I could still feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. I stayed awake all night, clutching the lantern like a lifeline, until the faint glow of dawn, a dawn without the sun, broke the horizon. When I finally stepped outside, the snow was untouched, as if nothing had happened. But the people of the town avoided me, their eyes filled with quiet fear. No one spoke of the figure or the whispers, but I knew they'd seen it too. The polar night continued, and I counted the days until I could leave. But even now, far from that frozen town, I can still feel it watching, waiting. Because in a world where the sun never rises, some shadows are more than just darkness.